When I first got into photography back in 2014, I was just excited to have a real camera in my hands, a little Nikon D3200. But if I'm honest, I had no idea what I was doing. Terms like shutter speed, aperture and ISO sounded too technical and intimidating, and that mode dial on top of the camera. I could see the letters S, A, M, but at the time they felt like they were settings for professionals, not for me. So I ignored them to the point I almost erased them from my site. So I did what probably most beginners do. I turned the dial straight to auto. This little green icon became my comfort zone. I figured that the camera is probably smart enough to make all the right decisions. All I had to do was to just point my camera and shoot. And for a while, it worked. But then I started noticing something. My photos didn't quite look right. Some were too dark, others were blown by light. Sometimes the subject would be blurry, although I thought I was holding the camera steady. And worst of all, they didn't look anything like the beautiful photos I saw online from photographers I admired. That's when I had my first aha moment. Maybe the auto mode wasn't enough. I realized that if I really wanted to grow, I had to get uncomfortable. I didn't jump into manual mode straight away, but I started reading, watching videos and slowly trying to understand those scary settings I would ignore for so long. It wasn't about switching modes overnight, but it was more about understanding what those S, A and M on the dial meant. I thought if I understood this, I would have a lead that would help me dive deeper into photography. As I started digging in, I finally discovered what those mysterious letters on the dial stood for. And suddenly, things began to click. S stands for shutter priority, how fast or slow the shutter remains open while the camera takes a photo, and the camera takes care of the rest. It's ideal when you want to freeze motion or capture blur, like capturing someone standing in front of a moving train. A stands for aperture priority. This time you control the aperture, the size of the lens opening, which affects how much light reaches the sensor and also how much of your scene is in focus. It's perfect for portraits, street shots, or anytime you want to control how much of your scene is in focus. Whether you want to capture the entire scene in focus or whether you want to create some nice out of focus backgrounds. And then there is M, the manual mode. The final boss, as I would come to realize later. I used to be terrified of it. In manual you take full control of everything, shutter speed, aperture and ISO. It sounded way too overwhelming at first, so for a while I left it alone. I still didn't know how to use this information, but at least a bit of light had been cast on those letters on my dial. And suddenly I started noticing them again. They weren't just cryptic options anymore. They were the doorway to something deeper. If you're enjoying the video so far, hit the like button and consider subscribing with the bell. Let's see now how this simple realization led me to learn one of the most important things in photography. That curiosity pushed me further. I began to wonder, what are those settings? What is aperture? What is shutter speed? What is ISO? And then if I'm going to use these modes, how am I actually going to make the right choices? That's when I stumbled upon one of the most important concepts in photography, the exposure triangle. At first it felt complicated, but the more I learned about it, the more it started to make sense. It was like finding the missing piece that tied everything together: aperture, ISO and shutter speed, the three fundamental elements that will control how your photo will turn out. If you know this, you can do anything. I didn't try to master everything at once. I took it step by step. I started with shutter speed, probably because I was already frustrated with those blurry photos. I learned that a fast shutter speed like 1 to 500 of a second could freeze motion, while a slower shutter speed like 1 to 15 of a second could create motion blur. Suddenly I could freeze motion, but also those blurry photos of people walking weren't mistakes anymore. They were creative tools when used intentionally. Then I looked into aperture. I had always loved those portraits that the subject would pop from the background, and finally now I knew how this effect was created. A wide aperture like f1.8 can give you this dreamy background blur if you're close enough to your subject, while a narrower aperture like f8 or f11 can keep more of the scene in focus. This changed completely how I saw light and depth in my photos. Last came the ISO, the setting I used to ignore completely. I used to think that higher ISO is bad because it can introduce noise to the photo, but then I learned that sometimes it's worthwhile to push it in order to get the photo. Especially in low light, ISO became a tool to help me stay flexible even when the conditions weren't ideal. As I continued experimenting with shutter speed, aperture and ISO, I started to see how they all work together, like pieces of a puzzle. Each one affects the others, and adjusting one would force me to rethink the others. For example, if I wanted to freeze motion with a fast shutter speed, I would have to open my aperture and increase my ISO if I wanted to maintain the correct exposure. Or if I opened up my aperture to f1.8, for example, to create those nice blurry backgrounds, I would have to increase my shutter speed, make my shutter speed faster, or decrease my ISO to avoid overexposing my photo. Understanding how these three elements balanced each other became my key to unlocking full creative control, and that's exactly when things started to click. Once I understood the exposure triangle and I experimented with the two semi-auto modes of the camera, shutter speed priority and aperture priority, I began to see how each offered different creative possibilities. But there was still one final mode: manual. The mode that terrified me in the beginning. With manual, I could control everything: shutter speed, aperture and ISO. It was like finally unlocking the full potential of the camera. But here is the thing. It wasn't as scary as I would once thought. By this point, I had a good understanding of how each element works, so manual mode felt like the next natural step. The true beauty of the manual mode is that it allows you to decide exactly how you want every element of the exposure triangle to work. All of these modes have their strengths, and when they're used intentionally, they can unlock great creative potential. Manual mode, though it allows you to control every setting, it can slow you down since you have to adjust every setting simultaneously. Aperture priority is fantastic for fast-paced environments, especially when you only care about how much of your scene is in focus. But it is not as good when you want to create long exposure shots. Shutter speed priority, on the other hand, is perfect for those more creative shots, especially with slow shutter speeds. But it lags behind in cases like when you want to capture those smooth out-of-focus backgrounds. Personally, and after using all of them for a long time, I settled between manual and aperture priority mode, as they provide the balance of control I need when I'm shooting out in the streets. I like to move quickly and stay creative, and these modes allow me to do just that. Looking back, learning about my camera settings wasn't just about the technical skills. It was a turning point in my photography. At first I relied exclusively on auto mode, but when I understood the exposure triangle and started experimenting with shutter priority, aperture priority and manual modes, everything changed. My photos became more intentional and I gained real creative control. I stopped just capturing random moments and started crafting images, freezing motion, blurring backgrounds and shaping the light exactly how I wanted it. The more I practiced, the more confident I became. Photography stopped being about what the camera could do and became about what I could do with it. And that's the real reward, realizing that camera and settings are just tools to tell your story. The more you understand them, the more freedom you have to create. So whether you're just starting out or have been shooting for years, keep experimenting, keep learning, because that's exactly where real growth happens. What is your favorite exposure mode and why? I would be very interested to know. Now, if you want to know some essential tips that help me master street photography after 10 years of shooting, click and watch this video next. That was all for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I will see you on the streets. Bye bye.